It's wanting me to view the lobby, and I've got to physically admit everyone. Okay.
Nicely done. You're like a technology whiz kid.
Hello, everyone. And oh, isn't that interesting? We set this webinar up exactly like the other one, but I'm having to admit folks manually. Well, hello, everybody. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say I can keep an eye on the lobby while you're introducing Pete.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I am not going to, well, hi everyone, Teresa Cross, PEBB Wellness Manager. I won't spend a lot of time introducing myself or the speaker because we want him to focus and present his material. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pete Rutagliano from Mercer. If you have questions as we move through the material, please put those in the chat. We'll also be saving time at the end of the webinar for questions, but if something comes up that you're really not understanding that he's covering, pop it in the chat. I'll be monitoring it and we can address it depending on what it is in the moment. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Rutagliano.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for the intros. So thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to present this information to you today. A little bit about myself. My name is Pete Rutagliano. I've been working at Mercer for about 18 years. I'm the behavioral health practice leader for the United States. In terms of my background, I have a PhD in clinical psychology and also in health psychology. And really, I've been helping companies with the mental health and well-being of their employees for, I guess, about 25 or 30 years now. In terms of my old background, I was also a clinician for a number of years, so I kind of get some of this well-being stuff. As we go through these results, what I'm going to be speaking to is the fact that I've been doing this kind of research for a very long time. So I'm going to try to give a lot of examples to help give a better understanding of the data. You might have sat in for another training with Debbie, who did basically was report training, but her training was more positioned at how it works. Mine is about how to make it work for you, how to give it meaning, and what tricks that I use to really best understanding out of the data. So hopefully by the end of this, you guys will get a good feel for that. One thing I do want to point out to you when you look at your results is, and I'm going to emphasize this in a number of places, is we have to consider the results within the context of what's going on. Now, one of the things I happen to know when I look across all the industries, there are two industries that have been hit hardest this past year. Number one is healthcare. And then number two is education and also government and public service like that. That has been hit really, really hard. And there's a lot of questions about what's going on. So when interpreting your data, keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that we kind of wash our hands of it, that we are not going to pay attention to it, but just keep in mind that, hey, perhaps there's something we can do within the context of everything that's going on. And I'll report that as we move through the deck. So in terms of our agenda, these are the things I'm going to be going over. First, I'm going to talk about why action planning is important, to give you some background data and why I know that this could add value to you guys and to your organization. I'm also going to then go into understanding the survey reports themselves. In this, I'm going to add more information to the presentation you guys might have seen with Debbie. If you haven't seen Debbie's presentation, don't worry about it for now. I give enough information that you should be able to understand what's going on, but we've also posted in the chat if you guys want to review that training as well. From there, I go into interpreting the data, how to really get understanding of what's going on. We're going to go over conducting a feedback meeting, which is how we're going to sort of start explaining the results to other people, and then developing an action plan. This is how we can make change. Now, before I get into this, there are 5 slides that I want you guys to pay most attention to. And the reason why is because these are the 5 slides that after we've done the training, they're the 5 slides you'll probably refer to in the future. The other slides are great, but they're pretty easy to understand. These 5 are the ones you tend to go back to. So the numbers for those slides are slide 8, 23, 24, 30, and 39. So again, it's 8, 23, 24, 30, and 39. I'll also point out on the particular slides which ones are more important. And to be honest with you, it's usually pretty self evident. So let's start with turning data into action. So like I said, I've been doing these kind of research for many, many years, probably for about 19 years. I've been doing these specific kind of surveys. And one of the things that I have learned is the impact people's well-being has on their overall performance in the organization. And we've tied this together in multiple ways. And some of it's self-evident, right? If I feel happier at work, if I'm more content at work, if I'm free of medical issues and emotional issues, that's going to create more engagement. I'm going to be more conscientious at work, and I'm going to enjoy my work life. And what that's going to do is that's going to impact my performance. Some of them are pretty easy, obviously. If I'm not sick as often, or if I'm able to deal with my mental health and my emotional health, I'm less likely to miss work. So absenteeism tends to go down. In addition, turnover, when people are less engaged and more disconnected from work and their well-being scores are lower, people tend to turn over more frequently, right? What is it that I'm unhappy about? And the other one that I like to point out too is because my parents wanted me to be a physician, well, they wanted me to be a real doctor, is I could prove that my job helped save lives. We did some research back with the National Weather Service, and we found that parts of the organization that had the most engaged teams and the best well-being scores actually had the best lead time prediction with tornadoes. So at the end of the day, yeah, this work actually can have some really strong impact to the job. There's other factors here which we've shown related to more industry stuff, but we've tied these metrics together so that I know that the work we're doing here will have a really strong impact on employees' lives. And one of the ways that I want to point this out is, yeah, I've spoken a little bit about how well-being impacts performance. And obviously, that makes a lot of sense to us, right? If I'm distracted by something that's going on at home, that's going to impact me at work. I'm going to be less effective at work, right? I don't want people to be distracted by physical conditions or maybe emotional conditions or even financial concerns, right? That's going to detract from their work and they're not bringing their whole self to work. But the other thing about this also is I know through our work that if I make people happier and more content and we have a culture of well-being in the organization, I know that's going to impact them at home. And I'm always amazed at how frequently people come up to me and I'll do some sort of mental health training and they'll say to me, "Hey, Pete, I did that training with you. And actually, yeah, it helped me a little bit at work, but I've been using this stuff with my husband or my child or something like that." There is a very strong interplay within overall performance. The other thing about this, and I'm sure you guys have felt this as well, I know we are constantly bombarded with surveys. The vast majority of surveys you guys do, you never see the results of your survey. The difference is with a well-being survey or an engagement survey, and you guys know this on your team, given some of the projects that you guys work on, that if you don't do work on the survey, if you don't show people that you're taking those results, you're respecting the fact that they put that time toward it, and don't take action on it, it leads to frustration. So there's a common expression I hear, which is, I've taken at least 2 or 3 of these surveys and nothing has changed. Part of our job is to really make people feel like, hey, you know what? Things have changed as a result of me talking about it. And as a result, I'm more likely to participate in these surveys going further, as opposed to, every time you go into McDonald's or, Bagel Nosh or something like that, constantly taking those surveys. I never know what happens with those. So I stopped taking them. The other thing that's important, you don't have to make huge changes. And I am a strong believer in small steps. The small steps are the ones that really tend to lead to the biggest improvement. And this is really critical. Don't feel like you have to make some big, huge plan. It could be these small little plans. I always like the expression, how do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. So think about that when we try to make improvements. All those little small steps could lead up to something big. And as a result of this, If I know you take action on the results of the survey, I know for a fact it's going to lead to higher levels of performance within your organization. I've done that study probably a good 25 to 30 times over the course of my job here. So I don't even do the research anymore because I know it's a one-to-one relationship. You do something, it's going to lead to results. So this leads us to, all right, what's our plan forward? Pete said we need to take action. What are we going to do? Well, very simply, you guys are receiving the report. Our goal is to take action on these results. And as we think about the action we're taking, the first thing and the first step I want us to think about is, well, what gets in the way of successful actions? And the first thing that I think of are these 4 action derailers, or these are the things that get in the way of successful action taking. Number 1, and I will admit, being a data geek myself, analysis paralysis is the number 1 problem for me. Analysis paralysis is where you look at the report and you always want to look at more data. You keep thinking, well, let me dig deeper into that. Maybe there's some other knowledge. Let me dig deeper into that. Maybe there's other knowledge. A lot of people who go down that path, what happens is they wind up not taking action because they keep looking for deeper and deeper knowledge, which is fine, but you don't want that to get in the way of the action. Sometimes just take it at face value and just run with it is the best way to go. The other part of this is don't necessarily rush to solutions. We're going to talk about doing your feedback meeting and putting together action plans. You don't want to just look at the results and just immediately spring to action. You want to digest the results a little bit. The reason why you want to do that is you might not be interpreting it in the right way. There's different interpretations on what the results can mean, and we'll talk about that as we go through the deck. So give it a little time to absorb, to think about it, to stir for a little bit before we take actions. The last 2 are interrelated, and basically I call this the just right scale. You could over-personalize the results or under-personalize the results. The goal here is to be somewhere in between those. Over-personalization is where you feel guilty or bad, like, oh my God, I could have done a much better job on this. And what happens is it keeps you from being successful because you're overemphasizing the fact that you didn't do something you were supposed to do. The other side of that is, oh, that's not my fault. That's someone else's fault, but that's a different reason, right? A good example of that would be the politics that are going on right now. And let's say there isn't money available for funding or stuff like that. Yes, that's a problem. I don't have much control over that, but I do have control within that realm. Even though the context that I'm specifying, there is something I don't have control over. I don't know what funding is going to be like in my organization going forward, but I do have a little bit of control over, and that's what I want you guys to think about. And by the way, this is also something when you're thinking about the feedback meeting, you want to try to balance people who are over personalizing and under personalizing to get to that just right phase. So from here, we want to think about our action planning roadmap. Step 1 is I want you guys to really understand your report. I want you to interpret the results, and I'm going to give you some quick hints on how to do that. From here, we're going to work on putting together our agenda for our feedback meeting. And the feedback meeting is where we communicate the results to our leaders and our teams, and then they have an opportunity to give you feedback and come up with the action plans, which is the last step. Now, one thing that's critical in this is I know your organization isn't like your everyday company that I work with, right? You guys are leaders, you're managers, you might be maybe change agents within your organizations, right? I know that there's just not one means of, cracking this nut. Sometimes, because I've been doing the same training for 18 years, I might slip in and say the word manager. Really, if I say that, I'm really talking about all of you on the phone, all of you guys that are the change agents for the organization, that you guys are the ones that are going to discuss this with your teammates, with the other leaders of your organization to come up with, hey, what do these results mean? How can we make the best change and what actions we should take? So actually, as we move on, this chapter, part 2, understanding your report, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this at a pretty high level. The difference between how I'm presenting this for like the next 10 slides and how Debbie presented it when she did her report training is I'm going to talk about how do I get meaning out of it. And what I'm going to do is, as we're going through some of the slides, I'm going to say, you know what? I don't really pay much attention to this slide, or excuse me, this chapter, or this is the most important chapter. You guys could use them as much or as little as you want, but these are the ones where I feel like I get the most meat out, and hopefully that'll point you in the right direction. You could create whatever path you want, but this is a good way to start. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So the first part is a little word about confidentiality, and this is important to recognize. Reports are only being created that have 200 responses or more, and this will protect the confidentiality of the individuals who have taken it. We'll probably be jiggering that a little bit next year, or at least the next time we do the survey, and have a lower number there. This way we could be a little bit more actionable, but this is what we decided to do for this go around. When looking at the reports, we're going to talk about the different ways of comparing your results. You're going to see comparison to PEBB overall, and you're also going to be seeing comparisons to Mercer's benchmarks. I'm going to explain why well, let me at the high level say this. When looking at the results of the survey, an overall score does have some value, but it really comes to have more meaning when you're comparing it to someone else. My son, as an example, came in and I said, oh, how did you do on your philosophy exam? He said, oh, I got a 75. And I'm like, dude, what happened? And then he said, oh, Dad, it was the highest grade in the class. I had a very different experience when he said 75 compared to the highest grade in the class. So having that context is really important. And I'll explain that as we're going through these results. So as I move on, the results are shown in percent favorable. And the way we calculate it is anyone that said agree or strongly agree shows up in that green bar under favorable. Anyone in the yellow are those who said neither agree nor disagree. And those in the red are those who said disagree or strongly disagree. The reason we group it this way is, quite frankly, if I gave you a score of 3.7 or 3.8, it really means nothing at the end of the day. So we converted into this percentage to give it more value. If I see a score of 75% favorable, what that means is 75% of the people who took the survey feel that way, right? If I'm in a room of 10 people and I know 70% of that group agrees with me, I know there are 3 people in the group that don't agree with me. That number has value. If I said, oh, you have a score of 3.5, that means nothing to you. That's why we use those percent favorable scores. And by the way, this is true across all industries. It's very, very common that we do that kind of reporting in this survey world. Then down below, we show you how to interpret different scores between various groups. We use a cutoff score of 5 points or more as our standard convention. By the way, notice we don't call it statistical significance. We call it meaningful difference. Geeky statistics reasons why we do that. We call it a meaningful difference between various groups that'll show up. And you'll see on later slides where that shows up. If it's green and 5 or more, that means you're ahead of something. If it's red or 5 or more, that means you're below something. So let's very quickly go over the chapters. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I know a lot of you have already seen the reports. Some of you have actually attended the training that Deb had put together. The dashboard slide is where I start. It gives me that 50,000-foot view. I don't spend a lot of time on this slide. And pretty much I look at this slide, I'm like, oh, interesting. And then usually I don't look at it after that. But the big thing I want to do is get a feel for where the dimensions fall. So in this example, social is one of the highest scores, financial is one of the lowest scores. I get a general feel for what's showing up there. The favorable and most unfavorable and most favorable, I skip that altogether because quite frankly, it shows up on the next slide. The next slide are the top and bottom items. This one, again, I don't spend a lot of time on this. What I typically do is I look for general themes. If I'm going through the most favorable items, what are some of the themes? What is some of the consistency I'm seeing there? Like, oh, wow, there's a lot of questions here about emotional health that are really strong. Or maybe there are a lot of questions in here about financial health. that show up as most favorable. I start looking for those patterns. My goal after all of my interpretation is to come up with a story of what's going on in the results. I do the same thing for the unfavorable. What are the consistent themes that I want to look at? Again, I don't spend a lot of time in here. It just helps me to start creating my story. I typically jot down a couple of notes and then I move on from here. In fact, the next slide, some people love this slide. Some people just don't get it. This chapter compares you to PEBB overall. This is good because even if we don't have a benchmark for a question, you can always compare yourself to PEBB overall. That may be good, that may be bad. It's up to you guys to determine how much of a reference that is. But what I know is not every question is created equal. And that's a really important part of this. But I do know that if I'm performing better than PEBB, it's like, okay, in general, I'm doing better. That means something to me. Or maybe I'm scoring below. I'll get a feel for what's going on here. Again, I don't spend a lot of time here. It just gives me that 50,000-foot view. After I've seen the report the first time, I rarely ever go back to those chapters. The next chapter, though, is the heat map. And there's two chapters that I consider a phase 2 aspect of the report, right? I've already gone over the dashboard and the high level overview. Then I want to get into the meat. And then the phase 2 are the heat map and then the drill down. Usually what I recommend to people first is get a feel first for what's going on with your results. And then if you want to drill down a little deeper to get a better understanding, then I say, okay, go into the heat map. Heat map helps you, oh, I understand we have a problem with communication, but is there more information I can get out of this? I could drill down and maybe see what departments underneath me or what agencies underneath me are performing less well. It helps explain why I get the score for my organization. The two chapters that I spend the most time in is item detail and the all items chapter. I like the item detail because it has almost every item that's on the survey, and it gives me all this great information. Number one, it tells me what dimension it shows up in. So social, as an example, these are all the questions in social well-being. I see the overall scores. You can actually sort it by these little arrows, up and down arrows. I can see how they compare to the benchmarks. By the way, anything that has dots, little dashes there, that means there's just no benchmark comparison. And that's why it becomes important to look at the PEBB overall. Again, the second chapter that I use for a phase 2, where I'm doing a deeper dive, would be the drill down. Again, I would hold off looking at that until you have a good understanding of your story of the data, then drill down. Help me explain why there's a lower score in an area. That's when you look into this. But the first go around, I would skip the drill down as a start. Unique items. This is actually pretty good. This helps give some information about some of the questions. The unique items are all the items that don't fit that standard 5-point scale that has the green, the yellow, and the red. So that's where this shows up. Again, I don't spend a lot of time in here. The all items, though, this is the best chapter. This is the one where I play the most, and this is my sandbox, if you will. This is where I look through all the results. The reason I like this the best is because I can see everyone at once, and then I can ask myself questions about it. I could sort the data by fave, neutral, unfave. I could sort it by comparison to PEBB or the different norms, so it gives me a better understanding of the data. So now that you got a feel for the data, now I want to talk about interpreting it. And just getting the report itself isn't really enough. And we call these different interpretive lenses. It's a different way of looking at the data. The numbers are just the numbers, but they have different meanings to them. And that's where I want you guys to think about it through these different interpretive lenses. The first one is about interpreting the results, and I'll talk about that. How do I grab meaning out of the data? Then I also want to gauge your reaction to it because that's really critical. We'll talk about that. The context, probably in my life, this is probably the third time that context is absolutely positively critical, right? 9/11, it was critical. During the Great Recession, it was critical. And now it's really critical. There's a lot of stuff going on, especially within education, especially within government, that is really critical to look at the context in which the data is in. We'll talk about that. And then the last part is, what are my priorities? What really are my goals at the end of the day? The outcome of all this work in interpreting should be coming up with a basic story. I think of it as like the elevator speech. If someone came to me on the elevator and they say, hey, what did the scores look like for our well-being survey? You want to be able to tell the story. Hey, overall, we're looking pretty good. These are our strengths. These are our opportunities. And these are some of the things I need to know a little bit more information on. And then I might also sketch out some possible actions that I want to vet out with my people. That's the goal of interpreting the results. So the first part I mentioned is starting off with the numbers. General rule of thumb, something that's 75% or higher is a positive result. If you have scores that show up that are less than 75, it's an area you want to investigate, you want to look into, right? You look for things that have a high level of neutral, maybe things would have a higher level of unfavorable. Areas that are definite opportunity areas, anything that shows up with 20% or more in the unfavorable is something you definitely want to take a sharp eye on. Now, by the way, these are general rules of thumb. Not every question is created equal. As an example of that, questions about immediate manager typically show up in the 70s and the 80s. That's just the way the story works. If I am looking at fair pay questions or workload questions, those scores are typically in the 50s or the 60s, right? So even though sometimes we take this attitude of thinking of the scores as grades in school, don't think that them that way. Think of them as general rules of thumb and then compare myself to the benchmarks. How do I compare myself to PEB? How do I compare myself to the norms? Okay. By the way, a couple of things about this. What I like about this is it just automatically creates a benchmark for you. If you're performing above PEB, overall, you should feel pretty good. But if you're still well below the benchmarks, the norms, then maybe there's another conversation. By the way, we include two norms in there. It'll be either the education norm or the government norm, and then also the United States norm or the different norms we have. The reason why we show the two is because number one, there's differences between education and government and the rest of the USA norm, but sometimes we just don't have enough data in those very specific industry norms. So we like to give you at least some rule of thumb. Now, people say to me, well, Pete, we can't compare ourselves to general industry because, working in a school or working for the government is completely different than working at another organization. Yeah, a little bit, but what makes people happy in their job, what gives them their overall well-being, doesn't really vary much by industry. And quite frankly, just because someone works maybe in an educational institution or for the government, it doesn't mean they're always going to work in that space. I used to be a college professor. I was a college professor for 70 years. Not 77. I'm not that old. I worked in it for 7 years and I decided, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. And I went into industry. Right? So consider that when reviewing the results. Strive to get the highest score possible. Don't think, oh, we're equal to the education norm. That's good enough, even though we're far below the USA norm. Always want to strive to get better. The second piece of this has a lot to do with me being a psychologist, but also how the data has meaning. The numbers in and of themselves are just numbers, but they have meaning to them. And when you review the results, and I'm sure you guys had this experience, when you looked at the data, you probably saw some things that's like, wow, our scores were higher. That's great. Or maybe our scores were lower than I expected, right? There's negative and positive affect you had from reviewing the results. Sometimes there was clear. You had clarity with the results. Oh, that totally makes sense. That's what I expected. Or maybe you're confused. Wow, that's really weird. Every time I do a survey, there's always positive and negative, clear and confusing. And in fact, there's a lot of times that there's good surprises and bad surprises. A lot of times what'll happen is people will say, wow, I didn't realize our scores for pay are kind of normal. People complain about pay all the time. By the way, that is the number one most common good surprise. Oh, our scores about fair pay are better than I thought they would be. And the reason why is because people tend to complain about pay the most. It's easier to complain about, right? That's the zeitgeist. People love complaining about their pay. But when you compare yourself to the benchmarks, we're not doing that bad. But now let's pay attention to the things that we are performing less well on. The other piece of this, though, is when you're getting your reaction, you want to start asking yourselves questions about the results. You should always assume that not everyone is going to interpret the data the same as you will. So have questions coming out of your reactions. Sometimes it might be, wow, I'm really not sure what this means. Sometimes I think it might mean this. Or it might mean, I think it means this. What do you guys think? Right? Getting that little bit of data that happens in the feedback meeting. The last one is about the context, and this is really critical. More so now, especially in education and especially in government. We're in a weird time in our world, and anyone who's been around the block for a while knows that this is very different this year compared to other years. When looking at the results, we want to compare your results to what's going on in your own life and how that impacts the results, but also what's going on with your team, what's going on within PEB overall, what's going on within your specific organization, but also what's the context, the region, the market, the location, what's going on in the US overall. That doesn't mean you don't have control over it, and you might not have any control over it, but you want to interpret it within that context, and that becomes really critical. At the end of this, your goal is to create that elevator speech or a story. Now, you guys don't have to use this template. I throw this in here just to give you like a starting point. I always like having a starting point because it makes it easier to come up with the story at the end of the day by giving a starter. You can change it around the way you think makes the most sense for your organization, the leaders that you're working with. But the general rule of thumb is you want to be able to talk about overall how are things going, right? Are people healthy or are they engaged, right? How good or how bad are we performing now? Always want to start with some of your strengths. What are you doing good at? You also want to talk about what your opportunities are. You want to talk about the things you're surprised about, things you're not surprised about. What are some of the questions you have? And you really should have a couple of questions on what you should discuss. That overall story sets the tone for the meeting that you're going to be doing, the feedback meeting, which is actually the next chapter. So after you review the data, you put some notes together. Don't feel like you need to have all the answers. In fact, if you've done this right, you should say, I know what this means. I think I know what this means. I am not clear at all what this means. One of the things I do want to point out about the questions, which is really critical, is I guarantee you when you go over this, you're going to say, you know what? I wish they would have asked the question this way instead. I've been doing this for an incredibly long time, making surveys. I promise you, I will never create the perfect survey nor the perfect question. We design the questions the way we have on purpose to be sufficiently vague to get a good feel for what's going on in the organization. And it creates dialogue. The goal of this survey is not to get the results. The goal of this survey really is to create questions. And when we design the questions, they have to work for people with different levels of education, people from different countries, people with different languages. We want to make it so that most people are going to understand exactly what that question means, so we have a consistent result so we can compare it to the benchmark. I guarantee you every question is going to be slightly different from every organization and every company that we work with. So keep that in mind. So the feedback meeting is really the opportunity to communicate the groups to your leaders, the people that you are going to be taking actions with. You want to share your ideas, and whether you're a leader or maybe you're a change agent or maybe you're a project manager, whatever your role is on this is a very critical role. You want to take into consideration the stuff that I'm talking about, but you also want to take into consideration what you know about your organization and the number of years you're working there. That plays a lot of context into that. You want to share your ideas about the results. And like I said before, you want to ask a lot of questions. You want to try to get as much dialogue from your group as possible. Now, given my experience working in education, in all fairness, I haven't worked a lot in government, but I have worked a lot in education. People in education love to talk and to debate. That probably won't be the hard part of the conversation. But what you want to make sure, though, is focus on the things you have the most control over, be as collaborative as possible, and try to facilitate a discussion as much as possible so everyone can contribute. That's really the goal of the meeting. And in fact, when we put together the checklist, and this is a very simple checklist, We want to make sure that we include all of the leaders or change agents or managers within your area. That makes sense. Try to get as many people there as possible. I typically like to have the meeting in person as possible, but I understand we're a post-COVID world. Just do the best you can. You want to have about an hour worth of time. That's really important. And you want to make sure people know in advance the purpose of the meeting. You can decide whether or not to share the results with them or not, but make sure they know the meeting is about, hey, we want to take action on the results. When going through it, really critical, you do not have to talk about every question on the survey. Don't do that. It's boring if you do that. But what you want to try to do is create a balanced picture where you tell the story. I use the rule of thumb that you want to give an insult sandwich, is what I call it, where you talk about some of the positive sides of the results, then you talk about some of the opportunities or negative parts of the results, and then you kind of sum it up with some sort of positive thing like, wow, I'm excited that a number of people decided to take this survey. That means they want to see change. We have some positive results here, but we still have some opportunities for change. General rule of thumb, I look for a third positive, a third negative, and then a third talking a little bit about actioning. That's kind of the way I typically break up the meeting. So this is typically how the meeting will progress. You'll talk about the agenda and the purpose. You'll set some ground rules. Hey, this is what we're going to talk about. You want to talk about your strengths. You want to explore the opportunity areas. You want to talk about some of the prizes. Make sure there's a really nice dialogue. We also want to put it into context. And again, this is really critical. And the one example I like to use with this is, every horror movie you've ever seen, there's always someone who gets hysterical, like they're screaming or yelling and they're not thinking. We don't want people to rant on this meeting. We want people to be constructive. And the way I think about it is you want to be like Sullenberger, right? The pilot who landed the plane in the Hudson. He was calm, cool, and collective. And he really thought about, well, what is it that we do to move forward? The context that he was in is he didn't have any engines to fly a plane, but he still had a glider at the end of the day, right? So he didn't perseverate around the context, which is, losing engines. He said, okay, how can I resolve this situation? And we're in the same space. And quite frankly, given everything that's going on in our industry, there's a lot going on. So we want to make sure that we concentrate the meeting on, okay, yes, within this context, what can we do about it? And that's critical. Usually I don't spend as much time here, but I've been noticing in the last 6 months, this has been a real critical component. Once you do that, you can address your key concerns, answer any questions, and then create this dialogue. And you really want to have an open discussion. When thinking about some of the do's and don'ts, some of these are pretty obvious. You want to try to allow people to create dialogue, but try not to make it too much about their own personal issues, right? What I see frequently in meetings, there's someone typically that has a very strong opinion. You want to try to manage them as much as possible and really just try to generate discussion. I try to get as many people to participate so it seems like a consensus at the end of the meeting. You've probably seen this before, but if you get stuck, right, if sometimes people are only focusing on the negative or maybe only talking about the context, I think the context is going to be a big issue. At least that's what I've been hearing with other organizations. We want to try to move past the context and get to some creative movement. Rule of thumb is I try to talk about a little bit. I recognize their concerns. Hey, yeah, you've been talking about some of the changes or whether or not there'll be funding there or something like that. I get that. What I'll do is I'll sort of acknowledge the concerns. I'll say, absolutely, that's a big concern. But what I'll do either is if it's a viable thing that we could talk about, maybe change, I'll table it. If it's something that it's just about the context, I'll try to nicely switch the focus onto something else that I know we can make some progress with. At the end of the day, this is the way we do it, right? We review the results. We're going to ask questions. We want to explore the various causes of what could be causing this to happen, trying to generate some solutions. And those solutions typically will start identifying some action plans. At the end of the feedback meeting, you should have a fairly good idea of what's going on with the data. You might not be completely clear. Maybe there's some things that people still want to think about. you want to sketch out a couple of action plans, but you don't want to prescribe what you're going to do. Usually at this point, at the end of this meeting, I'll have like 3 to 5 things that these are the key areas I want to focus on. And then in our follow-up meeting, that's when we'll come up with the action plan. And the action plans will typically show up one of 2 ways. Either A, we'll have a follow-up meeting where we'll specifically sketch out the action plans, or sometimes what people do is, oh, you know what, we have a sketch of this, we could do it through email and decide which ones. It's up to you guys to decide really what position works best for you guys. And the last part is about action plans. Action planning is the most important part of this. People are not going to feel like they were listened to if we don't take action on the results. And that's really critical. And I know you guys are in the middle of your 2-year action planning procedures. When putting together your action plan, the first thing I like to think about is these 3 categories, which has to do with my ability to just kind of run with the data. The first one is actions that you could do with your team, your part of the organization. They don't need approvals. You guys can just run with it, right? So the example I have here is, oh, we want better communication in the organization. That's an easy one. We can cover that. Sometimes there are actions that might require approvals, right? Maybe you need a budget approval for something. Like the example I use is, oh, we need extra training. Well, we don't have it in the budget. Maybe we can go to, the board and ask for a little bit more money for some training. The other ones are things that are really outside of your span of control. These could be things like, oh, changing benefits. You don't have the ability to specifically change your benefits, but if enough of the agencies come forward and say, hey, these are some of the benefits change we'd like to see, that could be something that could be part of a greater action plan for the organization overall. So don't take it as, oh, we don't have any control over this, so we're not going to talk about it at all. If people are talking about, hey, we need better financial benefits, or we need better therapy, or we need something else, these should be things that we want to communicate up the ranks. Oh, and by the way, the other thing too, especially when it comes to things like benefits, a lot of times people complain like, hey, we don't have any therapy benefits. And it's like, yeah, we totally do. We haven't communicated this as well. And a lot of times that's what you have control over. So it might be, hey, people are complaining about their benefits. And the reason they're complaining is because they don't know that they exist, or we haven't communicated it into a way, or maybe we have a new benefit in there and we haven't let it trickle down. That's a really critical part of this. What we want to do is, honestly, after we've come up with our 3 to 5 action areas, these gaps that we want to fix, we want to think about, this is our current work environment. Where's the desired work environment? Your desired work environment should be, I want a culture of well-being. And that cultural well-being will make it a happier place to work. It'll be more constructive. People enjoy working there. And actually, it has this viscous cycle where when people are happier at work, it impacts their mental health and it actually impacts their physical health. And these should be part of the goals of the organization. But when I think about what actions I want to take, when I prioritize my action, it's not just about what my organizational goals are, but where am I going to get the most bang for my buck? When I do my action plan, I look at these 2 metrics, which has to do with how much effort do I have to put into it and what's the relative impact. And typically when I decide which action I'm going to take first, the first action I typically go for, it would be an action that is fairly easy, that I could push out there to the market. Maybe it's not going to have a big impact, but at least people will see that I'm doing something and they're going to recognize that, hey, wow, they're listening to us. They're trying to make change. And then from there, then you go on to the harder things. This is a really good trick to making people feel like, hey, we're making a difference through this action. I'm sure you guys have seen the SMART plans before, so I'm not going to belabor this. The biggest things that I like to point out, though, is when writing up your action plans, make them measurable, have specific actionable steps, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then really you want to have it time bound. When is this going to happen? So I put together a very simple and not a very good action plan example. So the first one up here, if we had poor ratings on communication, an action plan might be talk with employees regularly to share information. Who's going to do it? Well, everyone's going to do it. When are we going to do it? Well, as needed. That is a horrible action plan. What we want to do, though, is be a lot more specific. It doesn't mean it has to be a tome. It doesn't have to be this huge list. In fact, I find you want to be parsimonious with your responses. Try to make it meaty and short. People are much more likely to read it. If you make it 15 pages, no one's going to read it. So this example is improve communications, establish a regular cadence for communicating. The actions are have weekly meetings, update employees on latest events, get input on current issues, maybe set monthly one-to-one meetings. Who's going to do it? I'm going to identify a specific manager who's responsible for it. And when am I going to do this? I'm going to set up these meetings at the beginning of this week, and we're going to follow up monthly on this, right? This follows that SMART framework. The last piece of the puzzle is what I call the 007 page. And you guys might have seen this in Austin Powers. We remember this from old James Bond movies, where the villain would always create this elaborate setup, and then they never checked on it, and he just went away, and James Bond always got away. But what you want to do is, after you've did the action, you want to follow up on it. Is the plan working? You want to ask questions. Why or why not is this working? Maybe it needs more time, and this is really critical. It typically takes at least 6 months for any actions you take to really take hold. So try not to rush it. Don't get frustrated too early. But you do have to make a decision. All right, are we going to stay the course, or maybe we're going to revise it? And then if you revise the plan, how much change is really required? Always check in with your plan to make sure it's working. And at the end of the day, this process, we've done this for many, many years. It works really well. It'll make sure people feel like they're valued, that we respect their well-being, that we consider them by looking at the report, really interpreting the results, doing that feedback, and then taking actions. When people start seeing actions, then they start feeling like, wow, the company really cares about me. This organization believes in me as a person. Okay, I know I've gone through a lot. So why don't we can close my presentation and then sort of ask some questions now. Does anyone have any questions? I know I went through a lot of slides. Teresa, is there anything else you want to add? Anything I forgot or I missed?
I don't think you forgot anything, Pete. You covered everything well. I don't see any questions in the chat. I did communicate with someone offline during the webinar. They were asking about any slides from the webinar that Pete mentioned that Debbie had done last month. The link to the recording of that webinar is in the chat. There were no slides to that webinar because Debbie was walking folks through the platform online and showing them how to use it.
One question that I see here, and I think we should cover this, is that the results of this survey were from quite a while ago, right? It took a while for us to get the reports out. It's the first time we were doing this. There was some cracks in the system that we've worked through. It's been a while since the data. That doesn't mean the data is less valid. In fact, quite frankly, I would probably assume that the scores are probably a little bit lower given the political environment and what's been going on in these two industries. So you can pretty much assume that they probably didn't get better. And usually what we see is things fall or raise sort of uniformly for the most part. So without having new data, we need to run with these and say, okay, these are the results that we have in front of us. And that's the direction that we should take. So keep that in mind, especially if someone says, oh, these are from years ago, these don't count anymore. I will tell you, I've been working with some companies for 17 years of collecting their data. It doesn't change dramatically year over year, and the pattern stays almost exactly the same unless they're working on specific things. So I would guarantee your results, if we took it today, would probably be fairly similar to where it was, when everyone took the survey.
For those of you who are on this webinar and who will be involved in updating your agency's 2-year wellness plan, if you dive into your report and you see some things that raise some questions and you want more information about, one, you can either contact me, but two, that might be something you want to explore a little bit deeper by questioning your employees, doing some informal surveys, some conversations, just see what's going on with the pulse in your workplace and let whatever you learn from your employees inform the update to your 2-year wellness plan. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions. Thank you for attending. We'll let you go. Do reach out if you've got questions about the survey. If you do not have, if you go to the page that I put in the chat and you do not have a report of results for your workplace, for your agency, it's because there weren't enough people that responded. But your results are rolled up into the PEB overall report. So you will see that at the same link that's in the chat, each agency and the PEB overall report. And Mickey, you don't see the link. If you're referring to the link for the surveys, it's up above in the chat. It says survey reports can be found here. And then there's a chat, a link. And I think we joined after you put it in the chat, so you can't see it. Oh, isn't that strange? Okay, well, let me do it again then. Same thing with the link to the webinar that Debbie did. Okay, there's the survey reports. And I will also put the link to the, well, looks like I'm not going to be able to do that. Just a minute here. Yeah. Mouse is being very touchy. Copy. All right, there we go. Oh, thanks, Sarah. Sarah did it again. Okay, so the link to the April webinar with Debbie where she walked folks through the platform, where you can dive into the results more deeply than the reports that Pete went over, is in the chat, as well as the link to where the PDF survey reports are kept on the PEB website. So thank you very much for being here, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
And Sarah, I remembered to hit end event.
All right.